This episode is brought to you by Vital Farms. Isn't it bullshit to have to question where your food comes from? At Vital Farms, you can trace your pasture-raised eggs all the way back to the source, the pasture. On the side of each pasture-raised carton of eggs, you'll find the name of the farm where your eggs were laid. And when you look the farm up on their website, you'll get a peek at all the sunshine, fresh air, and open space the hens enjoy. Learn more and find out where to buy them at vitalfarms.com. Vital Farms, keeping it bullshit-free.
Welcome to the HCI family of podcasts. We're your source for personal, professional, and organizational growth and development. We share our own original research, explore industry trends, and interview executives and thought leaders from across the globe. Join us for practitioner-oriented content around all things leadership, HR, talent management, organizational development, and change management. Maximize your personal and organizational potential with the HCI family of podcasts. Welcome to the podcast. In this podcast episode, I talk with Joe Schaeppi about embracing failure and creating psychological safety. Joe Schaeppi, welcome to the conversation today.
Thanks, Sean.
Pleasure to be with you. You're joining us from the Minneapolis area. I'm south of Salt Lake City in Utah. And today we're going to be talking about embracing failure and creating psychological safety at work. I think that's such an important topic. It's one I'm quite passionate about. I'm really thrilled to have a chance to chat with you and explore your experiences at your company around this topic. As we get started, I wanted to share Joe's bio with everybody. Joe Schaeppi is a visionary in human cognition who wants to fundamentally change the way brands and audiences connect. As the CEO and founder of Solstin, an AI-powered tool for human-centric experiences, Joe is pioneering the use of video game for cognitive assessment, opening up new possibilities for not only the gaming industry, but for mental health diagnostics and treatment. And I could go on, Joe, but I'm going to pause there. Anything in particular you would like to highlight by way of your background, personal context, or your company before we dive on in?
Maybe just that this has all been a part of my life's journey. Really from early on was focused on how do we elevate human awareness? How do we do that? And it comes from, we have to be able to measure these things. So, started out working in hospitals, wanted to be a doctor, realized that about half the patients in ERs, have mental health things going on, which of 7 of 8 of those in the United States basically go misdiagnosed or undiagnosed. So huge challenge. And went into the world of UX because I was asking myself, well, how can we build experiences? How can we architect things in a way that maybe it feels like a small town in Italy where there's lots of human connection versus a gridded city in, I don't know, the United States, which is built around efficiency and cars, but not really around human beings. So went that direction and realized that it was time to go back to clinical psychology. So actually, when I was in Salt Lake City at McCann there, and interned with a woman named Dr. Sugarman, who's one of the top neuropsychologists in the U.S. She's based in Salt Lake, but started seeing patients, doing neuropsych evals to figure out how we can measure this stuff, and really stumbled upon play, and how well play is positioned to really understand human psychology, and not just understand ourselves, but also evolve who we are. I think it takes like about 500 repetitions of a thing from a cognitive perspective to be able to change a synapse. But when you're in a state of play, it's like only 10 times. So
interesting.
Worked as an adventure-based psychotherapist, did a lot of psych evals, and founded Solstin about 6 years ago. So we work with all the major companies in gaming, from Activision to EA to a lot of young growing companies, but helping them understand their audiences. And we're at the literal frontier of understanding human psychology. So we've been kind of the AI of that for the last 6 years.
That is so cool. I'm in the education space, whether it's in a corporate setting, executive development, training and development stuff, or in the university setting, which is where I spend most of my time, training students and preparing them for the workforce. We try to use gamification components quite a bit in a lot of our curriculum, and that's been fun to play with and to explore. I suppose there's probably some gamification elements in what you're describing, but I think you're describing something a little bit different in terms of utilizing games for that cognitive assessment. Could you describe it perhaps a little bit more?
Yeah, so there's a saying it's that I really appreciate and I like. It's show me how you play and I'll tell you who you are. Back when I was in Utah, I do adventure-based therapy with people. One of my favorite activities was you get like a couple, husband, wife, you put them in a canoe, the really tippy kind, not the like nice stable kind. And you say, for example, to the husband, you're going to go 45 degrees to the right and then 45 degrees to the left and end up at that spot right there. The wife's not listening to this. And then you go to the wife, you're going to go 45 degrees to the left and 45 degrees to the right and end up at the same spot. So initially they're going opposite directions. Now in life, about 80% of communication plus is body language. It's not verbal. So you can both go in the canoe now. You're not allowed to verbally communicate. You can hand signal, whatever you want. And I step back. And the tippier the relationship, the tippier the canoe. A lot of couples end up in the water yelling at each other. We were supposed to go that way. We were supposed to go that way. And now I'm getting to, not be on a couch as a therapist, but I'm getting to observe reality and I'm getting to observe what they argue. They forget that I'm there. Like I'm not even there anymore. And then I'll step in and say, hey, where were you supposed to end up? And usually they both yell and point to the same spot. And then there's this kind of look of bewilderment on their faces. And you come in and say, hey, do you ever think there's times in your relationship where you both have different ideas on how to get somewhere? And sometimes they're opposite. But if you came together and really communicated, really understood each other, it's just a straight line. And, those couples will come back the next week. They're like, oh my gosh, that solves so many problems for us. You can spend all the time you want on a couch talking through things. It takes a lot of time to change synapses and how they associate with each other. And when we play, our most authentic version of ourselves come out. So our masks, like they're called our histrionics, they go away. This authenticity comes out. It's part of the reason why there's no Mark Zuckerberg out there measuring your psychology from what you do on Instagram. It's just not authentic enough behavior. But in games, you get this really authentic behavior. Their base gets destroyed and they rebuild it really quickly. That could be predictive of how resilient that person is, which has a lot to do with psychological safety of a community. Higher levels of resilience equals safer communities. And so then games want safer communities. And there's 3 billion people in the world that play games every day. Only 4 billion people have smart devices. So you can kind of do the math in terms of human beings were geared towards play. There's some research showing that around the age of 30, our crystal memory continues to go up, but our fluid memory goes down. Games offer that thing that, medically speaking, in the past, we would just give these questionnaires or what we call assessments, where we're assessing things like depression, anxiety, etc. And then the patient goes away and, weeks go by, stuff happens. So with games, there's that real-time loop. And that's one of the challenges with a lot of times companies will come to us and say, we want to do gamification. And the reason why Solston works with real game companies is it is very, very, very hard to make a fun game. And that's all games are is play with rules. And a lot of people say, well, we're going to gamify it. And I said, do you have to give people reminders? So a lot of the medical industry, for example, will gamify certain things or think that they're doing that. And they still have to remind people and send push notifications to get people back into things like digital therapeutics. And it's like, well, it's not a game. It's not fun. Just because you have game elements doesn't make it a game. Game is supposed to be fun. Game is supposed to have play. So that's where Solston works with basically some of the biggest games out there. So when people are playing these games, we're anonymously understanding individuals on about 300 different psychological facets. And then we measure also things like addiction, depression, sleep quality. So we're making sure that these games are impacting users in a way that's sustainable and regenerative. The idea being is, how do you walk away from technology feeling like, wow, I got more from that experience than it took from me? So that's a key focus. And then those measurements, like we can measure things like anxiety at 97% accuracy in certain games, where like some of the best clinical assessments in the world can only do that at 85% accuracy. So we're already beyond what you would get at the doctor. And that's part of what we're doing is we're advancing the ability to measure and then adapt environments so that they're more sustainable for human beings.
That is so cool. I love learning more about this. And I couldn't help but just relate to and deeply resonate with your story about the canoe. So my wife and I were in Costa Rica this past May. We weren't doing like a couples therapy canoe thing. Like it sounds like you were describing where that was the sole purpose. We were just doing a canoe tour, right? And we were going through these really tight spots. I'm trying to remember what the name of the trees were. Anyways, it was beautiful. It was a lot of fun. We were in one of those dual, very small dual canoes, very rocky, right? And the tour guide, he mentioned, he's like, so just so you know, people often do better when they're in individual canoes. If you're together, it's really going to test your marriage.
Love it.
And I just thought that was so funny. And we did it, and we didn't fall in, and I think we did pretty well, but it was challenging for sure. Like we just had different ways of doing it, and we had different kind of approaches and styles, and it was frustrating, right? Because we just weren't always on the same page. So anyways, it deeply resonated with that experience. And I think we learned a lot from doing that, even though that wasn't the purpose of going on this canoe tour. And just hearing you talk about how you can use gaming to measure all these different psychological processes, I think that's super fascinating. It's just a reminder that we live in a world full of data that's being collected constantly, and we need to better understand how to utilize the existing and available data in ways that can help us do things better, to function better, to be more healthy, all of those things. I think that's super important, super cool to hear about what you're doing at Solston. All right, I want to shift now and talk a little bit about the culture there at Solston around this idea of psychological safety. So as I introduce the topic for today, embracing failure, creating psychological safety, people might think, why in the world would you want to embrace failure? Why in the world would we want an environment where people feel like it's okay to fail? We want success. We want people to only do, successful things. How would you respond to someone, a leader who takes that kind of an approach?
Yes.
Why is failure helpful? How can it be helpful? Why do we want to embrace failure? And then we can start to connect that to the psychological safety piece.
Yeah. And I think that you can't speak with one without the other. You can't really be in an environment where you can fail well without having components of psychological safety. And one of the challenges, I think, especially building a company, is you're in a do or die situation. So it's very different for large corporates, like if you're Google or Facebook, things like that. This can be architected into the system, where a lot of times startups, it's either die or you move forward. And so what we see is people that have high levels of emotional resilience are far more likely to create psychologically safe environments. And a lot of people, one of the mistakes people make is most of the time that the people that are asking for psychological safety are the most unsafe people. They're oftentimes, because we do assessments with our team, they're oftentimes the people that are causing things to be less safe. So if you think of like a little kid that's in trouble, and they're going to go to the safest adult in the room. They're not going to go to somebody who's kind of weak and meek. They're going to go to somebody who looks stable. If we think of some of the most psychologically stable people are actually pilots. If you look at the psychological evaluations of pilots, they're incredible people. There's a reason why our skies are so safe. Let's just put it that way. And these pilots have to go through evals every 2 years. And so when we think of failure, something's only a failure if the person doesn't learn. Yeah. And so culturally, I think it's interesting. Like Solston, we're a startup. We're about 70 people. We're growing, but we were rated the top 100 companies in the world to work for innovators by Fast Company. And one of the reasons for that, I think, is we do have an emphasis on psychological assessments, but it's not what everyone is going to think. Like there's literally a book called Against Empathy that's written by a psychologist. And the point is, how do we move towards rational compassion? A lot of people mistake empathy for compassion, where empathy is just the ability to read somebody's emotions. It's like someone like Donald Trump, not to be political, but he's very good at the empathetic skill of relating to the emotions of his audience and then using those to create an end for himself. So empathy is really a tool. It's a cognitive tool, but that compassion aspect is actually, how do we make things better for the whole? And so when we're thinking of the whole of the company, that means that we need to have values, for example, that are built around learning. So failure, for example, this is what I tell the team. It's only a failure if you didn't learn. So if we make mistakes, that's okay. That's a part of what's here. And I think it's normalizing some of these things. So what's the fabric of emotional resilience? Because not everybody has it to start with. And usually the people that don't have it are like, hey, I have some issues. This person said this thing happened. And a lot of the skills to actually talk through things with people, like we have about 25 different countries represented at Solston. And I've had times where people on both ends of the political spectrum, from different countries, from different religions, from different belief systems, get mad at another person. And the things happen. It's 2023. This is the workplace. And the reality is, hey, if we're both going to be rationally compassionate, if we're both going to be able to work through things, we have to be able to understand each other. You don't have to believe what the other person believes, but you have to be able to reach that common ground. And it's, if you take it from a point of learning, you're there to be curious and learn about the other person. And one of the things we talk about internally too is this idea of theory of mind. So a lot of people lack theory of mind. They're in a grocery store, they're really angry, something happened, and they're looking around for all the other people that should be angry too. And they're not finding other people that are angry. We tend to place our idea of reality onto all the people around us, when in fact, just like the canoe examples that we said earlier, everyone has different realities that are happening. And a lot of people say, I want more diversity. I want more diversity. Well, diversity comes with different realities. And typically the people that want more diversity want more diversity, but people who think like them. And so that's not what we're going for here. We want people that think in different ways, that come to things from different perspectives. So I think with failure specifically, it's creating a culture where we are on an adventure. I like it's like the Shackleton, quote that's like, men wanted for a journey, certain failure, compensated if we make it back alive. And I think a big part of it from the beginning is setting people up with clear expectations. Like in our case, like you're joining a startup. We're a well-funded startup, but we're still a startup. And so there's certain risks that come with that. Do you want to do that or not? And some people think, yeah, like that sounds great. But then they come into the company and they realize, oh, this is very different than working at a big company. And we assume risks with everything. Like when you work at a very big company, you assume the risk that you're probably not going to have a lot of impact. You're probably not going to work on really interesting things every day. If you get lucky, maybe one of your products makes it to market in 3 years from now, something like that. It's when you work at a startup, what you use will be scrutinized, will go into the market. And when people adopt that learning mindset, and I think it goes back to the fixed versus mastery type thing. So we interview for that. We look at, do people have a mastery based mindset or a fixed mindset? Because if you want to have a culture where failure is okay, and you want to have a culture that's psychologically safe, you have to have people too that have a mastery based mindset, where they're willing to go into, whether it's a difficult conversation or whether it's their own failures at the job, from a point of learning. And once we unlock learning, there's no such thing as failure. And that's what we kind of have as a principle for the company. You're only failing if you're not learning.
Yeah. Well, and we should also say, like, nobody wants catastrophic failures. I mean, there's failure and then there's failure. So, a lot of times we talk about falling forward, failing fast, iterating rapidly, right? And so in each of those cases, failure is not failure. It's learning, it's growth, it's hypothesizing, it's testing, it's iterating, right?
Yep. But I think a lot of people they struggle with even that. Like I had an employee that said, this needs to be perfect. And there's a modern saying that comes from like modern psychology that's not totally accurate, but it's like perfectionism is a trauma response, or I'm a recovering perfectionist is a quote unquote. And really, real trauma is a whole different thing, clinically speaking. But when we do look at people that tend to be perfectionists, they are guarding insecurities is what's happening. And so, exactly. Like even we're a culture of failing forward, you will see a lot of people get challenged with that. So when I used to coach UX people, and some of the past people that some of them work for us still at Solston here. But I'd say, hey, we need to work on XYZ. And I can tell they're a perfectionist. By Friday, would love to review, some designs, some mock-ups, some tests of what you've done. And then I wouldn't even look at it, and I'd crumple it up and throw it in the bin or have them put in the trash can on their computer. And you watch that person. And what we're doing is we're dissolving some of that ego and attachment to that perfectionism. And it's amazing how the creator, once they get unbound from that, how much more successful they become in their job. And I was talking with Devin, who's an employee at Solston. She's our UX lead. And she's like, that was so painful, like 8 years ago, going through that. And it's a lot of times when people are, more junior in their career and haven't gone to that destruction, rebirth sort of process in terms of creation, that I think they get caught up in the failure cycle. But yeah, you're absolutely right. There's that, but I don't think many companies are actually good at it. I don't think a lot of people are good at, we can all agree on, let's fail forward. But a lot of people, in terms of implementing it and the efficiencies and then educating on the learnings, especially that part, we see organizationally, because we work with a lot of different companies. I mean, we work with like Peloton, we work with all these game studios. And I think when you look at company culture, they can agree on a value set, but then it's like, are you good at taking those failures, turning them into learnings, and then pushing them across an organization in a way where other people get to take part in those learnings? A lot of companies struggle with that.
Yeah. I mean, closing the loop in the first place is really hard. And it's something a lot of people just don't do. So the whole point of embracing failure is, it's not failure if you learn. That means there has to be a feedback loop, and there has to be a dissemination loop. Like there has to be mechanisms to share. And a lot of organizations, a lot of leaders just aren't good at that. I know one of the things you talk about at Solston is making failure easy. Can you talk to that a little bit more? I mean, this plays back into the psychological safety piece. How do we make failure easier, especially if people are, let's say, for example, younger in your career, you're trying to prove yourself, you're trying to, establish yourself and your credibility. It's very tempting to only put forward the successes to make you seem brilliant, but how do you make that failure easier, I guess, and so people can start to lean into that?
Yeah, I think there's two parts to that. And this is what's tricky for organizations. One is on the values and principles of the organization. So, when a person goes out, works on something, and it's a lot easier to do this on the product side of the company than on the growth side of the company. So if you fail, if your numbers are not there on the sales side, they're not there. That's what it is. And so failure has a different veil, I think, on the growth sides of companies than it does on the product side of companies. But from a value perspective, what we encourage teams to do is we put this on the team leads. We say, sit down with your team, talk about the 3 to 4 peak experiences that they've had at the company and the 3 to 4 worst experiences that they've had at the company. Now, create values around those things. So what were the values present during those peak experiences? And what were the values that weren't present during the bad experiences? So was it being misunderstood? Was it not feeling heard? Was it something like that? Well, what's the opposite of being misunderstood? Feeling understood. Okay, do that with your team. And now look together at what your value set is as a team, because values basically give us guiding pathways for our teams to really grow and be nurtured well. And that sets teams up for success. And that's where they know this is the kind of crayons that we can play with and colors we can play with. And that really allows for those sort of risk-taking things to happen. And then they know kind of how things are going to play out based on that. And it should be on the teams. Now, easier said than done. Reality is messy. Some leads are much better at it than other leads. And I think as an executive, it's our job to go in and then go back and work with those leads. It's not to jump in and tell those leads what to do, because they're going through that process too. So I think that's one. One thing Solston does is we're big on assessment. So up front, when people come to Solston, we look at, well, what are the traits that we see predict successful engineers, for example, at Solston? Like one of them is high levels of straightforwardness. When we interview for these things, it helps the sort of integration and we actually do psych assessments for these. It helps with integration, and specifically if we think of things like emotional and psychological resilience. I think a lot of people like the idea of joining a startup. Ooh, I get lots of equity. Ooh, I can take part in the upside. There's all these amazing stories of the first 1,000 people at Facebook all became millionaires, right, and these sort of things. People like the idea of that, but then the reality of that is either you have to two things. You have to look for people with high levels of resilience, full stop, the ability to bounce back from negative situations. And on top of that, you have to have systems that can help create that. So I don't see any world where you can have a company of innovators or builders that build well and succeed well that don't have that innovation underpinning. To that point, they're one of the oldest rubber companies. I forget the DuPont. So DuPont looked back all the way to 1906, and they had been doing different psych assessments with employees since the early 1900s. And they found that when people were on the intuitive side and thinking side of things, that about 90% of those projects went to market and made money. Where when people were on the judging side and sensing side, psychologically, only 16% of those projects went to market and made money. So the fabric, there's a Harvard Business Review article that I wrote with my business partner on how to build teams based on psychology. 4 of the companies that were in his incubator all went on to become successful. So, and we built those teams based on the psychology of the group. So I'm a huge advocate of from the start, looking for people that have high levels of emotional resilience. You can ask people like, hey, what's the hardest thing you've ever done at work? What's one of the hardest things that you've had to get through? And they'll share whatever they want to share, but that can give you a pretty good idea of, is this person somebody who can have difficult conversations, who can bounce back from negative things? And there's people out there that it's not your job as a company. That's the therapist's job. It's not your job as a company to create an emotionally resilient person. And to be quite honest, it's kind of like, as a therapist, because I've been on both sides, it's kind of like doing surgery with people. Like if someone comes in and says, I want to be more emotionally resilient, when you go in and the doctor gives you stitches, it's going to hurt probably, even if you have some Novocaine. It's going to hurt. And a good therapist is going to probably go to places about yourself that you don't like. There's your shadow. And you have to get through those things to be more resilient. And so I think a lot of companies try to take that on. And what it should be more like is, I think Bezos said something like, we have these 10 Amazon principles, and there's people that come here who are like, oh my gosh, I love being at Amazon. And there's people that come here and go, this is not for me. And that's why those were designed. You should feel out of place at a company, and it's your job, if you're not the right person, and it's your job as the founders to know what are the things that made you successful. Like, it's very different if you're Monday.com building spreadsheets than if you're like a military industrial startup whose technology is people are depending on it from a living perspective. It's probably a different group of people that you need to innovate both of those things. And it's not good or bad or right or wrong. It's just, what's the team I need to take us to where we want to go to.
Yeah. Well said. Joe, this has just been a fascinating conversation. I feel like we could go on and on and on, but I do note the time, and I need to let you go here in just a minute. As we wrap things up for today, I just wanted to give you a chance to share with the audience how they can connect with you, find out more about your work, your team, and then give us the final word on the topic for today.
Yeah. So you can go to solston.io to connect with our company, or if you go to wellbeing.solston.io, we actually have a free assessment that we put out. It was during COVID, but it's actually for emotional resilience. So you can take it, see your data. We don't collect any data from that. It's just out there for people to see. So that's kind of fun. You can find me on LinkedIn. My email is joe@solston.io if you want to plug it in and add me or follow. And yeah, maybe just final thoughts for the day is, given the focus on failure and emotional resilience, I think if you start with the emotional resilience piece, everything else follows. So, the Harvard Business Review article that we wrote that touches on psychological safety and some of that psychological safety. And I think maybe this is for everyone listening, an important note is it's the outcome of resilient teams. So that's when we look at all the studies from Google and what we saw there, the underpinning of that is it's a group of resilient people, and that's what makes everybody feel safe. So focus on resilience, and psychological safety follows.
Wonderful. Yep. Wonderful. Joe, thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure. I encourage the audience to reach out, get connected, find out more about what Joe and his team can do for you. And as always, I hope everyone can stay healthy and safe, that you can find meaning and purpose at work each and every day. And I hope you all have a great week. Thanks for joining us for this episode of the podcast. We hope you stay healthy and safe, and please join us again soon.